Okay, thank you for that nice introduction, and we're glad to be here. As Diane said, for the past 12 years, my wife and I have been working in a country overseas that's about halfway divided between Christians and Muslims. Historically, these two groups lived together at peace, but about 6 years ago, tensions began to rise. There was violence. The government is very concerned about what's happening between the two groups. Last summer, while we were on the ground there, we found out that radical Islamists have now really infiltrated many of the institutions, the mosques and other institutions there, and have become a very significant problem. In the past summer, we spent 3 days each with 3 large groups groups of Muslim leaders who have large followings in the thousands of people. And it's quite an interesting experience to sit down with them and get their perspective on these things, and that has shaped us a great deal. We didn't expect to do that. That was not our original intention in going to that country. But through a series of connections and relationships, we found ourselves now deeply embedded in what's going on in the Muslim communities. And it's from those perspectives that I want to share today some of the perspectives that we've gotten, not only through our personal contacts with them, the face-to-face contacts, but also through the research and through the mentoring we've received from experts in Islam, both overseas and here. So I'd like to begin by asking you a question. Our invasion of Iraq began about 13 years ago. We still have a presence there in Afghanistan. And so here's the question. Take a guess. How many civilians in the United States would you guess have been killed by Islamic terrorists since 9/11? This is civilians in the United States killed by terrorists since 9/11. Just call out some numbers about what you think that number is.
50.
50? Any other guesses?
20.
How many?
20.
20? Okay. The exact number is 45, so the guess at 50 was close. Just to give some perspective, this is about the same number of people that it's estimated have been killed in the United States by having a piece of furniture fall on them. Okay, now another question. How many civilians would you guess were killed in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan? This is civilians as a direct result of the United States military actions there. What would be your guess? 30,000? 100,000? The correct conservative answer is 1.3 million civilians killed as a direct result of our military intervention in these countries. So now how do you think that makes us look in these countries? Because it means that practically everyone in this country has known someone who's actually been killed by our bombs and bullets, or as a direct result of what we've done. And that doesn't count the number of civilians injured, let alone the thousands of Muslims who've been radicalized by these casualties. Now let's look at American military casualties. On 9/11, there were about 3,000 United States citizens killed on 9/11 in New York, and another 6,000 injured. But in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had over 6,800 Americans killed and almost 50,000 Americans injured in those two wars. Now, let's look at the financial cost of the United States. The direct financial cost for 9/11, there's about $55 billion lost immediately through the attacks. There's another $123 billion that were lost in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. But now, let's look at what we spent in those wars overseas. We've spent $1.6 trillion in direct costs, and we will spend another $4 to $6 trillion as aftermath that includes care of veterans, etc. And we've not begun to pay for that either, but our children certainly will. So now the question is, what have we bought for this enormous cost in human life and treasure? First of all, we've created ISIS in Iraq. We got rid of a brutal dictator who was not particularly a threat to us, and so we replaced that with something that's more of a threat to us. Our misguided fixation on democracy in Iraq put the majority Shiites into power, and they used it to slaughter the rival Sunnis. So this has polarized Iraq even more than it was when we began. In Afghanistan, the Taliban still remain a force after all our military efforts, but we've weakened them enough so that ISIS is starting to take over in Afghanistan too. So we have to ask, does this all make any sense, what we're doing? Are there better ways to conduct international policy? Osama bin Laden in 2004 made an interesting statement. It's interesting that he makes these statements publicly and somehow they don't get into our consciousness. Here's what he said. He said, "We are continuing this policy of bleeding America to the point of bankruptcy. All that we have to do is send 2 mujahideen to the farthest point east to raise a piece of cloth on which is written Al-Qaeda, in order to make generals race there to cause America to suffer human, economic, and political losses without achieving anything of note other than some benefit for their private corporations." So again, we ask, does this all make sense? Was Osama bin Laden right? Now, I'm not advocating capitulation, as you'll see shortly, but I do believe there's a way out of this quagmire. I'm neither advocating a pacifist or a military solution. I'm interested in what practically can we do to defend ourselves against the threat of ISIS. Misguided policies based on fear or arrogance don't get us anywhere. They cloud our vision and prevent us from pursuing rational solutions. So what I'd like to do in this talk is both to give a little deeper understanding about what's going on in the Islamic world and some practical ideas on what would be a constructive US policy. This is based not only on our research, as I said, but on face-to-face contacts with people who face that, not as we do overseas, but right in their own communities. And the first step is to understand something about the history of Islamic civilization, because that's what's led to this, this crisis that we're in. To oversimplify, I've broken it into 3 major periods in Islamic history. The first period was a period of expansion, which began with Muhammad and reached its zenith in about the middle of the 13th century. The colors on the map that you see represent stages of expansion from darkest to lightest. At its height, the Muslim Caliphate extended through portions of Russia, through the Middle East, through northern Africa, and into Spain. It covered 5.17 million square miles, and at that time it was the largest empire Earth had ever seen. The significance of this is this idea of glory and empire is deeply embedded into the Muslim mind. And what ISIS is trying to do today is to recreate that empire, although not as successfully, and it's doubtful they'll be able to do it. But then there was a second period in Islamic history which began in the middle of the 13th century and continued into the 18th. During that time, the empire began to collapse. Eventually, there was nothing left but Turkey, and Turkey eventually became a democratic state. So the caliphate ended. This required a new interpretation of the Quran and of jihad. And that new interpretation was supplied by the Sufis. Jihad was reinterpreted as a struggle, as a personal struggle against impurity and sin. External jihad, that is military conquest, became a secondary issue. Now, the reason this is an encouraging sign for us is it means that there's the possibility that Islam as a civilization can adjust to a peaceful manifestation. And we expect that actually will have to happen, whether they like it or not. Eventually, you have to come to terms with the world, and you can't continue on military adventurism, which is doing nothing but getting you killed. So there's some hope that the Islamic civilization will again return to that. However, we're now in a third period, which is characterized by Wahhabism. Wahhabism is a sect of Islam that returned to a militant version of Islam that was present in its first stage. It started as a small sect in the Arabian Peninsula. It allied itself with the Saud family, and the two groups together gained control of most of the Arabian Peninsula, which became Saudi Arabia in 1932. Now, this still would not have led to what we're experiencing, except for the fact that the discovery of oil in Saudi Arabia is seen to this day as evidence of God's blessing on Saudi Arabia and in turn on the Wahhabism expression of Islam. And that, the wealth, in addition, the wealth that the oil generated is what has been used to finance terroristic advances. Saudi Arabia has been the breeding ground for most of today's terrorist leaders, including Osama bin Laden and most of the terrorists behind 9/11. This sense of Allah's blessing and the US invasion into what is considered Islamic territory is what led first to Al-Qaeda and now leads to ISIS. Okay, now let me give you a little bit of perspective on ISIS and the Islamic world. If we don't understand how they think, it's very difficult to relate to them and very difficult to deal with this crisis. The first thing that's worth saying is what we're experiencing is primarily a war within Islam. Islamic civilization is now a very complex power structure between its various factions, both ideological and political, with the added complexity of one mistreated group, the Kurds, trying to find a national identity, trying to find either a homeland or some greater autonomy. Second, this is fundamentally an ideological war, but so was the French Revolution, so were the long religious wars in Europe and the West, as we sorted out our own religious and political order. So was our Civil War, which was a struggle over human rights and who had the power to define them. So civilizations and religions go through these periods of transition. We have gone through them, and Islam is now going through that as well. Although it's very important for us to protect ourselves, and I'm not minimizing that because we have been drawn into this conflict, but fundamentally we have to understand it is not our war, it is their war. Okay, another thing to understand about the Islamic world is there's an ambivalent attitude toward the West. We hold enormous economic and military power. We're both appreciated because we buy their oil, and we offer some protection to some of the countries, but we're also hated. The intrusion of Western modernism is resented as cultural imperialism. It's beamed into Islamic countries through the modern media. Modernism is especially tempting to young Muslims because of its promise of freedom and economic success. But it's also seen as intrusive and disruptive to Muslim culture, which has only rarely found a way to accommodate itself to Western culture, Turkey being the main example. The West, in the Muslim world, is seen as immoral because we glorify what they consider sexual sin and immodest female dress. We're seen as intemperate because of the prevalence of alcohol and drugs, and we're seen as godless because of the naturalistic worldview that dominates academia and the media. ISIS, I should say, not Islam, ISIS uses the West as a villain in order to rally the rest of the Islamic world behind its brutal version of Islam. ISIS uses terror in the West to, first of all, cover up its military setbacks. The only place where ISIS has actually occupied territory is in weak, failed states such as Iraq and Syria, where it's moved into a vacuum. For example, the November attack in Paris and other terrorist attacks have covered up their recent military losses. The mourning and hand-wringing over the terror, over the losses in Paris almost completely left their losses at that time unreported. Just this week, for example, Time magazine reported that since last May, ISIS has lost 40% of its Iraq holdings, 10% of its Syria holdings, has killed 20,000 ISIS soldiers, and its fighting force has fallen from 31,500 to 25,000. Attacks on oil wells have so hurt ISIS financially that the paychecks of their recruits have had to be cut in half. Important cities have been taken. Last December, the important city of Ramadi in Iraq was taken by Iraqi forces alone, although they were trained and supported by US soldiers. This increased capability of Iraq forces may have been slow in coming, but it's starting to materialize, and that should encourage us. Another reason that ISIS uses terror is to assert a symbolic power over the West. They want to keep alive in the Muslim minds who the villain is. And terror is an important recruiting tool for ISIS. Terror creates inordinate fear. Their attacks create a greater appearance of power than ISIS really has. The fear generated by these attacks create an out-of-proportion response to the actual threats they pose. The statistics I gave earlier indicate that. If as many people have been killed by a piece of furniture falling on them as by terrorists, it is not that those families haven't suffered a tremendous loss, but it's easy to overestimate that because you probably don't know anybody who's been killed by a piece of furniture falling on them. And finally, these terrorist acts goad us into disastrous wars that bankrupt us as Osama bin Laden predicted. The media, unfortunately, portrays a more negative assessment than is really the case. The same Time article that I cited was entitled 2 Steps Forward, 1 Step Back. But I read the article very carefully. They never said what was the step back. And yet that's in the title, and it creates an impression that this is a back and forth war, when actually ISIS is beginning systematically to lose. The reasons for this negative reporting are sometimes hard to understand, but here are some possible reasons. First of all, it's been a long conflict, and we're running out of patience. Secondly, it's a different kind of war than we've been used to fighting. We constantly think in military terms, and this fundamentally is not a conventional military war, and therefore we don't understand it and we don't know how to fight it. Terror causes inordinate fear and causes us to overestimate the danger that ISIS poses. I don't think there is no danger, but it's dangerous for us to overestimate it and overreact. Now, I have some good news. You might be surprised to hear this, but ISIS narrative is impossible for them to fulfill, in spite of what the media tends to put out. Their goal is territory, to create a new caliphate. However, the fact is they're either stalled or losing ground as we speak. They will not negotiate with any state, including Islamic ones. They demand either immediate capitulation or they threaten military conquest. But this can't work in the long run. No stable Islamic country will ever agree to these terms. And ISIS does not have the military means to enforce this. ISIS is dangerous, but we should not overestimate it either. We shouldn't let fear or an inordinate demand for 100% safety here in the United States cloud our vision. ISIS is stirring the world up, but they're also vulnerable. A few perspectives on ourselves. America no longer can impose its will anywhere we want, either economically or military. And the sooner we face that, the better, because otherwise we're in danger of doing foolish things which our past policy has shown do not accomplish our goals. And we need to learn from this disastrous policy and not think about repeating it. Furthermore, this is a situation in which military victory overseas will not necessarily stop terrorism in Western countries, because they're a different group of people. If a terrorist act is committed in the United States, God forbid, those terrorists are undoubtedly already here. ISIS is losing soldiers on the ground in Syria and Iraq and can't afford to send them over here to the United States. And so they've just mobilized terrorist communities around the United States to do that. But that will continue regardless of our military successes or losses overseas. Now, the fact is we can prevail with wisdom, patience, and because we have a superior ideology. We're in a war, and there will be casualties. Some are apt to be here at home. Our demand for 100% safety is unreasonable and prevents rational action. We should strive to minimize terrorism, and we should provide a good defense and vigilance. Yes, and we should rightly mourn such tragedies and do all we can to prevent them. But we will continue to make grave mistakes if we become obsessed with being 100% safe, because that is impossible. To prevail, we'll have to put several pieces together, and that's what I want to now present as kind of an alternate package to what we're doing. Now, military action is part of the package, but it can't be decisive. Containment, the support of allies, gradual rollbacks, all these things are helpful. But that's probably all we could do, and that's all we can do, and that's all we should do on that level. There are non-military means that we can use: shared intelligence, better cyber warfare, interfering with ISIS source of money and supply lines. And by the way, that is happening to a large degree, which is why they're having more difficulty continuing to operate. Special forces on the ground to train, guide bombings, and gather intelligence. These are all good things to do. But our biggest opportunity is the propaganda war. Perhaps the most important goal we ought to have is to stop the recruitment. This is going to happen through propaganda, not military action. If Time magazine in that same article was right, the conclusion would be that since March, they've had 13,500 new recruits to ISIS, and it's urgent that we stop this. But how do we do that? By matching and surpassing the very successful ISIS propaganda machine, which is what brings these recruits in. So we should contrast the atrocities that they're doing with the freedom and opportunity in the West, constantly beam that information into the Muslim world. We should encourage advocates of moderate Islam and give them an opportunity to project their message into the Islamic world. We should study ISIS recruitment techniques and learn how to counter them, including the use of social media. We're far behind them in that. That's an area that we really should move ahead, because that will stop what's keeping them going, which is their recruitment effort. But the trump card is humanitarian efforts. Nothing more dramatically undermines the anti-Western rhetoric of Islamists than that. Humanitarianism is right in its own merits, but we must do it prolifically and not keep it a secret. We must convince the world that it's one of our abiding values. That means things like opening our doors to refugees, certainly with vigilance and screening, we don't deny that, but they ought to be able to come here, and we need to publicize their stories of being received, cared for, and helped on the road to a good life here among us, including religious freedom. There are other humanitarian interventions. We saved the minority Yazidis in August 2014 with the help of the Kurds and prevented a genocide. We need to do these kind of things when there's opportunity to do them, and then publicize them throughout the world. We have to help countries such as Jordan, that's receiving an enormous number of refugees, to help them quickly integrate them into their country's mainstream. There are ghettos of disaffected Muslim young men around the world. We need to help them get integrated in the life stream of their countries, because they're ripe for recruitment into ISIS. And all this is a far less costly and more effective way to slow ISIS recruitment than bombs and bullets. In the long run, wicked ideologies cannot resist visions of goodness and hope. We need to understand that and get that message out to the world clearly. Now, there's an unpublicized but helpful trend going on, which has made us personally hopeful about how this could turn out. A large number of Muslims worldwide are leaving that faith, both through contacts with the modern Western world and because of ISIS atrocities. And these are moderate Muslims who are very disillusioned by what they see happening through the extremists. In addition, in the past 10 years, more Muslims have become followers of Isa al-Masih, the Quran's name for Jesus the Messiah, than in the entire previous history of Islam. They now number in the millions. Some are overtly becoming Christians. Many are staying within their Muslim communities and keeping many of the Muslim customs. In many places in the country we work, they are accepted as one more of the major sects in Islam, and in some cases they're even becoming community leaders. This is a spontaneous movement not really connected with Western missionaries. I was in a group of about 40 Muslim leaders this summer, and just out of curiosity, I said, how many of you have had a vision or dream in which you felt that Isa al-Masih, Jesus the Messiah, personally appeared to you in this vision or dream in a way that changed your life? Every hand in the room went up. Whatever you think of this, my point in mentioning it is, this is an additional hope that it gives us in the midst of this very messy situation that both we and they are involved in. What greatly encourages us in the country we work in is that the combination of moderate Muslims and Jesus-following Muslims is becoming a force for peace on the ground. We've personally heard their stories of radical Islamic forces being diffused in their villages and leaving their villages. We need to get behind such grassroots effort. This is the effort on the ground that's different from the effort from the top. Okay, in conclusion, I just wanted to say remind us, this is an ideological war within Islam, and we cannot win it by force alone. We should be vigilant and defend ourselves against attacks here. We have a better ideology than ISIS does, and that is what will be decisive in the long run. The best ideology is the one that best balances human aspiration for personal freedom, which everyone has. It's there in the Islamic world too, with the equally important need for order and stability. In spite of our weaknesses and turmoil and our fractured society, we do have something like that here. So let's not squander our present opportunities through fear and foolishness. I believe that if we don't give up on the things that really make us strong, if we act wisely, not impulsively, if we have courage, endurance, and perseverance, we can prevail. Thank you very much.